Welcome to Bad to Best, where I show you how to improve your filmmaking one mistake at a time. I've been making movies for years, but for a lot of that time I didn't have any real training, so I made a lot of mistakes. Hopefully, by showing you some of those mistakes in old movies that I've made, you'll be able to avoid making the same ones yourself. Today, we'll be continuing where we left off last time in No Pasarán, at the opening scene in a New York bar.
Now, today I want to talk about the writing in this scene. This scene was entirely ad-libbed. I came up with what needed to be communicated in the scene, and my brother and I took turns recording one another saying the line I had just made up. Now, this might work if you have top-notch actors who know their characters extremely well. That was not true in this case.
There's a war going on in Spain, as you've probably heard.
The acting and delivery is extremely stilted and unnatural, even more so than in the rest of the film.
Just because Comrade Stalin over there says to trot on over and give him a hand.
It's not about the ideology, Jack. We need fighters.
This comes down to script. I wrote a script for the majority of the film, but this scene was not in the screenplay I wrote, and the dialogue suffered as a result. A good script is very important. If the actors don't know what is going on in the scene, it will turn out just as forced and awkward as it did here. Spend time writing a script, and then go back and make revisions to it. Run it by people you know to see if it's working. Say the lines out loud to see if they sound as good out loud as they seem to on the page. Now, you may want to give your actors some leeway while shooting. Unless you really need them to get every single word perfect, it can be helpful to let them communicate the sense of the line without saying it exactly as written. Letting them say the lines in their own words can often make them sound more natural. Again though, having a script to work from is a must if you want to avoid scenes like this one.
The Spanish people are suffering, Jack.
What you're telling me is, you're gonna go die for a bunch of people you've never met, for a cause you don't particularly believe in, for money that might be delivered if the Soviets keep their word.
Alright, the stage is set. Time to get to the story. Actually no, let's do some more stage setting. When making the film, I debated how to structure this opening. Since it's set in a war that most people know very little about, I wanted to give some context to what was going on. However, having a big exposition dump right here after the first scene kills any momentum the story might have been building. If you need to communicate exposition to the audience, try to do it in a way that feels natural. The newsreel feel of this works alright, but I should probably have placed it before the first scene of the film. Actually, I could probably have combined it with the opening credit sequence. Killing two birds with one stone like that would have been much more effective than having credits, then a scene, then an exposition dump. Also, notice that the narrator's voice is distorted.
Despite being sympathetic to the beleaguered Republic, fear that supporting it could spark another world war, something they are determined to avoid at all costs. Thus,
I added an effect to make it sound as if it was an old recording, but I also cranked the volume up, causing a lot of distortion because of peaking. Unfortunately, peaking is an issue throughout pretty much the whole movie. If you want to know how to avoid peaking in your own movies, check out the previous video in this series. Now, after an opening credit sequence, a scene, and a whole bunch of exposition, we finally start the story. While the scene was meant to convey the boredom of the soldiers in the trenches who had little to do but wait for something to happen, it doesn't really grab the audience's attention. When you're telling a story, you need to get the audience invested in what's going on. There are a lot of different ways to do that, but the best is generally to introduce characters that the audience will care about. Good characters are at the heart of a good story. Long, lingering shots of characters waiting around is not exactly the best way to get the audience to care about them. That can work later into a story, but right now, it isn't doing much. There's not really anything to make the characters relatable, and there's not any questions to make the audience keep watching beyond, why are they waiting around? This scene could work a bit better if it focused more on the tension of the battle to come, giving the scene an ominous, foreboding feeling. Would not have made the characters more relatable, but it would have at least made the scene more interesting to watch. Let's look at the composition in this conversation now. When having a conversation between characters, you want to show visually that they are talking to one another. In this scene, I unknowingly made one of the worst mistakes you can make when shooting a film. I told the actors to look right at the camera when delivering their lines. Instead of showing 3 characters talking to each other, the scene shows 3 separate characters all talking directly to the audience. When shooting a conversation between characters, don't have them look at the camera. There are very few instances where you should ever have your actors looking into the camera. Instead, have them look at one another and then place the camera beside or behind the actor, opposite the one you were getting a close-up of. Let me show you what I mean with a scene from a film that I made several years after this one. Here, we have the 2 characters talking. They're looking at each other, not the camera, and we can see a little bit of the other character in the foreground of the shot. This really helps the viewer, since it shows that the characters are talking to someone, not just speaking into empty space. Use the whole screen, too. With this center composition, there's a ton of wasted space on either side of the character that is serving no purpose. When you shoot like this instead, you use that space to show where the characters are and even some of the dynamic between them.
So remember, when you're making a film, start out with a good script. Dialogue rarely just turns out well. It takes time spent writing to make good lines. When you need to communicate exposition, do it subtly. Don't just dump a bunch of information on the audience. When you begin the story, make sure that you hook the audience so that they'll want to keep watching to find out what'll happen next. And when you shoot a dialogue scene, make sure that the characters are talking to each other, not to the camera. Do that, and you'll go from bad to best in no time.